Hi everyone, we're here with author Sarah MacLean, author of Wicked and the Wallflower.
Hi.
And we're here for an interview, and she's going to be interviewed by Stephanie Anderson, a librarian. And we're so excited to have you guys here. So throughout, you can just give us some questions through the comments, and I'll interject, but I'm going to let Stephanie take it away.
Great, thank you.
Hey Sarah,
Hi.
what's up?
Thank you for coming.
Oh my
and
gosh.
Thank you all for coming. Thank
is
you
so
to Harper
exciting.
for having me.
I am so excited to talk to you in front of a lot of people. I feel like every time we talk, not in front of a lot of people, we have very interesting conversations.
We do,
They go all over the place. So Sarah and I have known each other, we were just thinking maybe 8 or 9 years?
Yeah,
Ever since
a long
9
time.
Rules to Break When Romancing a Rake
Yeah.
came out. And now we're up to like, what, 8 books? 9?
12 books.
12 books?
12 books.
Well, I'm a librarian. I'm not very good at numbers. And I just got to read, I will say as a sneak peek, Wicked and the Wallflower before this interview, and it's excellent. For everyone out there, pre-order it.
That's very kind.
And it's very spicy, very funny.
I try to be spicy and funny in life and in text.
So let's dive right into it. What made you write this particular story to sort of sway into, I would say, almost a little bit of a darker place?
Yeah.
Romance.
Well, it's my fourth series. It's my fourth series. And all the series are interconnected in a sort of loose way. And you'll see in this book similar characters will sort of wander by who you'll be familiar with. But to be totally honest, I was getting a little tired of writing kind of big ballroom scenes and heroes who were titled but didn't have very much to do. And I wanted to write sort of the other side. And I had danced around that for a while in some other series. So in the Rules of Scoundrel series, which is a casino series, I sort of wrote all these titled dudes who owned a casino together, and I got to write that sort of gambling, sort of sinful space, but it was still very, it was sort of very closed off and private from the rest of the sort of rarefied world that the heroines all lived in, and that the world where they existed outside of the club. This is different. This is set in Covent Garden in the 1840s. It is the heroes of the series are the bare knuckle bastards. They are smugglers. They are kings of Covent Garden, which at the time was not near as posh as it is now.
It's quite nice now.
Oh, it's beautiful now.
But back then it had a reputation.
No, back then it had a reputation. It was pretty nefarious. Like, there was a lot of crime there. There was a lot of, there was a lot of poverty there. It had a lot of the things that exist in cities.
Yeah.
And I got really excited about writing about these sort of princes of this world that I had never explored and that is rare to see in romance. It's not unheard of, but it's rare.
No, it's unusual, and I think, and you sort of kick it right off in a very, very subtle way by naming your hero Devil, in case anybody was wondering.
Right, the heroes are Devil and Beast,
yes, which is kind of great.
I mean, I like it. I feel like everyone needs a devil. Like, I feel like Lisa Kleypas has one of the most famous devil books.
Yep.
Stephanie Lawrence has a very famous devil book. And I'm sort of ready to maybe write my devil.
Did you have to do, because I know you've done a lot of research over the years working on these books, did you do more research specifically into Covent Garden to write about this? Or did anything inspire you that made it into the book?
Covent Garden is amazing.
Yeah.
Seven Dials, which is, right there in Covent Garden. If you've never been to London, you should Google Seven Dials. It's very cool, like street where it's a circle in the midst of Covent Garden where 7 streets come into a little tiny roundabout. It's very, very small space. Those of you who read Elizabeth Hoyt know a lot about Seven Dials probably. But when I get to London, when I'm in London, and I try to go at least once a year, usually twice a year, Covent Garden is one of my favorite places because it has such character. The Covent Garden Market is really great. And I met a guy there, an older man whose grandfather sold ice in Covent Garden, like lemon ices and raspberry ices. And he would buy the block of ice like on the docks and drag it up to Covent Garden and sell ice in the marketplace. This was his grandfather, so 100 years ago. And I got really interested in ice. Which my husband would tell
Very
you.
romantic, yes.
Yeah. Well, I also have a 4.5-year-old, so my husband is pretty sure this is related to Frozen, which I'm not going to deny. I mean, I was watching a whole lot of Frozen.
Wow.
Or rather, someone in my house was watching a whole lot of Frozen and, pretending she had ice powers a lot. So ice became sort of...
I have never seen Frozen.
You'll surely someday see it.
I've done a good job of avoiding it. Yeah. Have you replicated the story in this book? Is this a Frozen homage?
An homage to Frozen. No, but what's interesting about it is that when you start thinking about ice in the world...
Sure.
And I mean, I don't want to get you guys all hot and bothered thinking about refrigeration.
That's a big deal, yeah.
But refrigeration is a big deal.
Yeah.
And, before we had things like freezers, you had to get ice from somewhere. And so we would ship it.
We. All of us, really.
Yeah, exactly. In London, they would ship it in from Scandinavian countries on ships. They would fill these huge cargo ships with hundreds of tons of ice, but it would melt, obviously, because ice melts. And so they would come in up the Thames at high tide, and the ships would almost be sinking from the weight of the water, of the ice melt inside. And so I had this idea that was sort of, well, they couldn't get on, nobody could get onto the ships to see what was on there because they were literally too heavy and also full of water. So wouldn't that be a cool way to smuggle
That would be a great way to smuggle stuff, yeah. Too bad
Well,
you can't do it anymore, but yeah.
It's true.
Yes.
There's not a lot of ice smuggling anymore, I don't think, but...
There could be.
We're getting a lot of love. Just a reminder, guys, to post comments and questions so that we can ask Stephanie.
Everyone loves ice.
People are like, they love reading about ice and books.
They love ice.
People are, Diana saying...
You're taking a totally different turn as a writer.
No. Diana saying all-time favorite author.
Yeah.
Oh, thanks,
Yeah.
Hannah. That's so nice.
Be sure to post questions.
But also, ice is very sexy.
It is.
Which is helpful.
It's true.
When you're writing romance novels.
And then you have to put it in, I'm trying very hard not to spoil anything. You have to put it in very dark places.
Right, it has to be held underground.
Very hidden and, yeah.
It's worth saying
lots of corners.
Lots of corners.
Places you can hide your ice.
It's true. The whole book is set, with the exception of one scene, the book is set at night. It's the first book I've ever written.
You know what? That didn't even occur to me until just
entirely set at night.
Maybe that's why I said it felt dark.
Because it is literally dark.
It is literally dark. I mean, there's a lot of suspense in it, which I liked. I think it has a real romantic suspense element to it, where I was just like, oh no.
Yeah.
But also, it's literally dark.
It's literally dark.
Wow.
It's hard to see.
I was thinking through the plot, maybe she's wrong. Why would you be wrong? It's your book. Obviously, it's all set at night.
There's one scene not set at night, and it's actually set at dusk. And that's it.
And was that a deliberate choice? Did you write some daytime scenes and take them out, or how do you?
No, I knew I wanted to write a book.
Yeah,
at dark, in the dark, and use light as a whenever there is light, it's important.
Yeah. Well, and there's a lot of, I think what makes it feel so sensual too is that all the other senses become such a big deal. The smells and what people hear, and it really brings a different element of the story to life, which is great.
Yeah. And the whole book is really about unlocking things and seeing things in different ways, and the secrets that we keep and the way that we share them, the way that we find them, and light is a piece of that, right?
Yeah. So when you started writing romance novels,
yes, a long time ago,
I guess, was it 10 years
ago?
It
was 10 years. I mean,
is that when you started? How long did
it
take you to write and practice before you sold the first book?
I don't remember what month I sold my first book, but I sold my first book, has to have been early 2008 at least. So I'm 10 years.
10 years. Congratulations.
Thank you very much.
So did you think that at this point you would have written all these stories, been trying to start pushing, you get almost, the way I see your career sometimes is Sarah got very good and very comfortable with the rules and the tropes of Regency romance, and then was like, I wonder what I could do with these. I wonder how I could start pushing them a little bit. Was that always something you were thinking when you started writing? I'd like to see what I can do with this, or did it come from being a fan and wanting to try your hand at writing? Or
I mean, I think partially it's that. Partially it's I'm a reader first.
Yeah.
And I've been a romance reader for since I could read chapter books. And so it feels to me like I had read. I mean, I cut my teeth in the 80s and 90s and early 90s on the women who held up Regency. Jude Devereux and Judith McNaught and Julie Garwood so I've been reading. I read Julia Quinn and Amanda Quick and all of the sort of big Regency names throughout. And then when I started writing, it sort of was natural for me to iterate on those stories, which I think is true of many of us when we start. And 9 Rules to Break When Romancing Rake, which is my first romance novel, is a Wallflower Rake book, which this one is too. I'm going back to my roots. But for sure, as I read, and now that I read so many romance novels for a job too, it's pretty great to be able to really, romance has become such a massive genre. Not that it wasn't before, but now it's so big and so broad, and people are doing such cool things with it that I feel like it's a constant. My books, when I write, I often feel like I'm having a conversation with other books that I've loved, and sort of thinking about how I can be inspired by those books and how I can twist them and think. I feel like the whole genre is just constantly iterating on itself.
Do you think being a reviewer, and for those who don't know, Sarah reviews for the Washington Post, you write a monthly column, right? And and not just Regencies, but all different kinds of genres, subgenres, all kinds of romance, all romance though, right? Very important. Do you think reviewing has changed your own writing? Has it changed you as a reader?
I don't think reviewing has so much as the world in general has changed the way that I read and the way I write. I think that the column, what I love about the column for the Post is that the job description was very clearly put to me as choose your 3 favorite books of the month. Right. So I just get to read the way I've always read. Right, yeah. And then say, oh my gosh, read these 3. And what's interesting is that every month what I find is that there's always, where it used to sort of be at the beginning of the column that I would choose, 3 books that were just delightful confections. Now I'm sort of thinking about how romance can impact the reader. And I've always felt that it could, but now I feel like because I'm reviewing them, I'm able to say, well, this is it's a beautifully written book, yes, but it's also important in the world.
Yeah, I've noticed, so I also review romance novels for Kirkus, and I have noticed over the years a real marked trend, and I mostly review historical, towards, the heroes not just being very good looking and smart and whatever else that heroes are, but also having some other kind of feature, whether it's like a real awareness about social justice issues in a way that I frankly can't quite believe was that present in the Regency or Georgian eras.
Well, but I'm willing to grant fiction.
I'm willing to grant. Yes, I'm willing to suspend my disbelief. Or you have somebody. There's a lot more books that are sort of deliberately crafting heroes and heroines that have some kind of. I'm trying to think of the best way to put it without forcing the authors to do something maybe they're not doing. To say, oh, look, this is a character who maybe has OCD, or this character is suffering from PTSD, or something that wouldn't have been recognized at that time, but trying to say there's lots of different ways to find love, there's lots of different... and that seems to be, not that it wasn't done before, certainly it was, but it seems to be a huge trend, I'd say in the last 2 to 3 years in particular, almost to the point that I've wondered if it shows that what we think of as heroic has changed. That, like, it's not enough just to be good-looking and rich anymore. You also have to be this fundamentally good person, which seems like it puts romance novelists in a bit of a corner. Do you feel that way, or have you seen that trend yourself as a reader?
I think that the thing about romance in general is that, and I talk about, we've had this conversation a lot, but when you think about romance as a fairly young genre. It's the first romance novel when we talk about romances was published in 1972, right? We're talking about The Flame and the Flower by Kathleen Woodiwiss.
Which holds up surprisingly well.
Really, really well. Yeah. And I think, although it does represent a lot of the things that we struggle with as a genre, the hero rapes the heroine multiple times in the first 100 pages. There's a lot about this book. It has a lot of problems, but as a archetype for an adventure novel with a woman at the center, which is essentially the story of every romance novel, it stands. But from that moment, 1972 was a sort of very powerful watershed moment for the women's movement. And then as we move forward in romance, what we start to see is romance reflecting, constantly sort of mirroring society and reflecting back on society. And I think part of the reason why it's able to do that is because, one, romance writers write really fast.
Right.
And even now they write insanely fast.
Yes.
But even then they wrote, a book a year or a book every 18 months. Like, that's a quick turnaround for a writer. So there is a constant dialogue with society, but also because it's a story of women, right? And it's the only genre really at all that centers women and centers women in triumph.
Yep.
And so when we see that, of course, it's a conversation with society.
Right.
So I don't necessarily think that, as you said, I don't think it's new that we're struggling with, or that we're saying things in the books. And you can see that certainly in the 70s we see a lot of reflection in those books to the women's movement. In the 80s we see the working woman sort of rise in romance novels, and single title contemporaries become a thing. In the 90s we see sort of the rise of the beta hero, because economically we were okay, things were pretty settled, the Cold War was over, and then in 2001 9/11 happened, and then we see the rise of paranormal and this kind of idea of needing heroes who could tackle a big bad that no one else could tackle. We could literally save the world with these heroes and heroines. And then we had a massive recession in the late aughts, and billionaires came to be.
Right.
And now here we are in a very real time.
Yes.
And the books are changing. I think you're absolutely right. And the question is, what are they trying to say?
Yeah, what do you think?
But I think you're hitting on it.
I think Regency
is the evolution of the hero.
Like, Regency's kind of had so I came to romances as an adult, so I've had to kind of go back and read all of the older romances to understand the context, and it seems like Regency's maybe 5 years ago or so, probably actually around the time you were writing, there's like a huge explosion of new Regency writers, all writing very, what Iser, if you recall, a steamy romance or a spicy romance, lots of sex on the page, lots of very overtly feminist heroines.
Sure.
What do you think that tells us? Especially about if that started 5 to 10 years ago, what does that tell us? Now that we have a little hindsight on it.
I mean, sexual agency, obviously. I mean, the more sexual agency a heroine takes on the page, the better for me, because I feel like it's an important piece of what the dialogue that we're having now culturally is very much about that.
Yep.
More and more. I mean, literally today on the subway I was reading Twitter and just, going into a rage, and I feel like romance heroines are fighting that battle for us on the page, which is one thing. But I actually think that what we're seeing is less of an evolution of the heroine, because she's always been, from that moment in Flame in the Flower when Heather puts herself on a ship and sails across the or runs away from her abusive uncle. The heroine has always taken had agency. She's always taken initiative. The heroine is always proactive in a romance novel, in a great romance novel. That's sort of an expected thing. But I think that what's really interesting is what we're seeing is a change in the hero, like you said. And we're seeing heroes become more feminist. We're seeing heroes who have richer lives and have more nuanced ideas. In those early years, heroes were blank slates. Even as far back as, in 2010 with 50 Shades of Grey, like Christian Grey, it's written in the first person, right? So in first-person novels, heroes are kind of blank slates. And so it's a tricky thing for a writer who writes first-person heroines to show a nuanced hero. And so what we're starting to see across the board is really great writing, I think, because we're starting to see writers sort of tackle this idea of how a hero can be evolved. This kind of alpha feminist idea, which I think is it's the goal in many, many romances over the last 50 years. We've seen the evolution of a hero from sort of Neanderthal to feminist. I don't know if those are the two ends, but sometimes
it feels that way to me.
And so, because what we're looking at is partnership, right? We're looking at equal partnership. We're looking at a desire for your partner to have satisfaction, or a desire for your partner to triumph, or a desire to lift up the goals and thoughts of your partner. And this feels very feminist to me when it comes in the mouth of, a brusque medieval knight. And that's been there all the time, but now I think we're seeing it over and over again really overtly, and I love it.
Yeah, no, it's great. I always think about that Parks and Rec, do you watch Parks and Rec?
Yeah, men's rights is nothing.
No, yeah, that's right. Well, yes. That he proposes to her, and at one point, I can't remember if it's that scene or one scene, but they say, I love you and I like you. I actually think it's the wedding scene, I love you and I like you. And it's something that I've always thought is just like the sweetest thing, and it seems to me like romance went from being like, I love you and I want you, and now when you sort of get to the climactic scene, it's like, I love you and I like you. Like, they're always like, you're beautiful, and you're smart, and you love people, and this thing, and this thing.
And you tame wild wolves.
Exactly. And you're nice to my sister, and this thing. And there's something, I think it's very cool, but it's been interesting to see. And so this ties to another trend, which again, this is how it looks to me. I'll be curious how it looks to you. So I've lived in New York for about 10 years, and in that, managed a bookstore. Now I'm in a library. And in that time, I have seen both online and in person, romance go from something people did not really talk about as readers. So I've been working with readers for like 15 years in various jobs, to being something that more and more women, especially I would say of my generation, are willing to very overtly like go in and ask for books, to talk about online, to like, you know, I certainly, when people talk about romance in a library context, I'm always like, well, I read romance. Like, why are you going to? So there's still a lot of these biases out there, and I don't want to waste any of our time rehashing those.
Sure.
Everyone knows what they are. But I've noticed, and part of this is like, I think there's great online conversations. There's so many great websites, or even just on Twitter and Instagram, there's this real community that is not just reading romance, but proud of it and actively discussing it. And yeah, I know you have your own communities that you work with. Do you think that more readers are coming to romance sort of as a result of these evolutions we're talking about? Or do you think these evolutions are part of what's causing readers to talk about romance differently? Like, it's more of a chicken and egg thing,
It's
but
a
I'm
chicken
wondering if
and
you've
egg
seen
thing,
the
yeah.
same thing or can speak to it. Because obviously I live in New York, so I'm seeing one set of readers. There's readers of romance everywhere.
I mean, I do think that there, without question, over the last 4 or 5 years, we've started to really see a lot of respect for the genre publicly in not only, you know, the media, national publications, but also kind of in the literary world. We're being invited to things like, you know, book festivals, which we've never been welcome at before. And we're, you know, there are courses being taught on romance in more places than, you know, Bowling Green State University, which was one of the few places that actually paid attention to romance. And I think, so I do think that there's that. I also think that, again, it's the conversation about women in the world. It's the fact that we're becoming more and more aware of media by and about women, media that centers women, media that centers the female gaze, media that puts women and all marginalized people in triumph and represents them in, because there's nothing more triumphant than happily ever after, right? Yeah. And I don't just mean that in a romantic sexual love kind of way. I mean, like, at the end of a book, part of the happily ever after is that the reader, the covenant that I as a writer have with my reader is that when you close the book at the end, there is no doubt that these two people will be happy, and they will have and
whatever that means,
of course,
to them.
happy together in my world, but also just satisfied, and there's no doubt that they might fail. Triumph is the greatest sort of way to stick it to your enemy.
Yeah, it's true. To be happy.
And so I think it's about you know, third wave feminism, and the arc of the women's movement is the arc of the romance novel, and so maybe that's why we're having such positive responses. But certainly, I mean, we still fight the battles.
It's many a drunken bar argument for me. Yes,
exactly. Don't judge a book by its cover is a constant litany. I mean, people really do judge them.
We have some great comments. Thank you for participation in furthering the genre. What a phenomenal conversation. One question is, what did you think of the royal wedding and the rise of alpha feminism?
What's that? What is alpha feminism?
Alpha feminism.
Usually, when I don't know something, I can just look it up.
Well,
this is killer. As a librarian, this is like very painful. I have like reference questions.
I don't know if they're referring to the alpha feminist idea that I just sort of brought up. But
I think so.
Yeah.
I think they were
okay.
on
well, I'm going to take the first part of that question first because, oh my God, the royal wedding was amazing.
Great.
It was amazing.
That's great.
I watched it with my 4.5-year-old, and who is like my little barometer of like what is what is it? Because, I mean, she's my science project, right? I'm raising a woman in the world. And she, you know, dressed up. She knew she had to, like, she was ready. She had to be ready. She put on a veil, which was a piece of lace that I had from a grandmother somewhere. You know, she was ready. She was wearing a tiara. And yesterday we were in the car, and she was riveted. Like, my child sat through that entire mass and said not a word. She was riveted. It's a very long ceremony. To it. And then we were in the car yesterday, and she said to me, we were talking about something, and she asked me what I was doing, and while she was at school, and I said, I was writing, and she said, Mommy, what's your book about? And I realized I'd never told her that what my books are about, and I said, well, I write books about love. Did you know that? And she was like, I didn't, but maybe you could write a book about about getting married. And I was like, well, maybe I could, yeah. And then she's like Princess Meghan. I was like, if Meghan Markle, the Duchess of Sussex, I know she's not a princess, but if you marry a prince, wear a tiara, and live in a castle, you're a princess. Yes. So
I'm fine with that.
And I just feel like if Meghan Markle is my daughter's idea of what a princess is, we're okay. Like, she's gonna be fine. I loved the royal wedding. I loved every minute of it. Of course I did. It's so on brand.
Yeah, no, I actually was surprised. I knew I was going to watch it. Like, yeah. It's funny because I feel like if I were British, I would hate the royal family, just knowing my own political leanings. But then, like, as an American, I'm very charmed by all of it. And I like gossip, so, like, I like all that, too. But I accidentally didn't wake up to watch it live, so then I, like, had to go online, and the New York Times had all of it. And I happened to open it up to, like, they were looking at the castle, and like some cars were driving up to it, and I just burst into tears, and my husband was like, what's wrong with you? I was like, I don't know. There's just so much emotion around it. And he was very cathartic for everybody.
It's so obvious that they care for each other, too.
I'm glad you feel that way, because I was like, am I just talking myself into
when
how
I
they
look
look so happy?
No, and when you look at pictures of, like, Prince Charles and Diana, like she was so miserable, and there's nothing, I feel like, I mean, now this is going to be like Royal Wedding podcast, Royal Wedding Facebook Live, but I feel like Kate and William too, like they have such care for each other, and I'm fascinated by how they have to interact in public versus how Harry and Meghan have to interact in public. Like, there's so much air and sparing going on that I just adore as a romance reader / writer. I had to explain
that to Trevor, where he was like, "Why is he getting away with so much?" And I was like, "Well, he's the spare."
Yeah, no one cares anymore. He's like sixth in line. Nothing's gonna happen.
Exactly. Like,
he's never gonna.
And it's sad
touch
too.
The crown.
Like, everyone he loves would have to die for him to be the king.
Right.
Like, he's not
exactly.
He doesn't want to do it anyway. So
exactly.
It's very interesting. I have Anne Helen Peterson, who writes a lot about celebrity gossip. I thought about that a lot, where for those of you who aren't familiar with her, she talks about, I believe she has a PhD in this, which is very impressive.
If you'd known you could get a PhD in that, wouldn't you have done that?
I would have. No, I'm pretty good with my life, but that's a close second. And she talks a lot about and writes a lot about how one of the really valuable things about gossip is it's how we as a society share norms with one another.
Sure.
And like what we approve of and what we don't approve of. And so she likes to look at history to say, this was considered scandalous at the time, and it really tells us. And I think romances actually fill a really similar role. And so it's interesting. The one bad part of the wedding for me was that just in search of pictures, it's like I have to see all the pictures. I read a Daily Mail.
Oh, never do that.
And then I read the comments just out of sheer cussedness. I don't know what made me do it. And it was just after all this happiness, and I personally do not know anyone who actively hated the wedding. I know people who were disinterested in it.
Yeah.
But, and then to see how angry people were, because there was a part of me, I guess, that felt like, boy, people are really overplaying the importance of this. It's a wedding. Good for them. I wish someone else had planned my wedding too. I probably would have loved that. But then to see how furious people were, and it was so obviously. Like, a lot of the comments were they weren't even veiled racism.
Oh, sure, your racism is showing.
Racism and outright, just, just every reason under the sun to not be happy for people.
I think...
And, like, not only would you have those feelings, but then you would share them in public and, like, go out of your way to type them up so other people could see them. I was really flabbergasted. So then I closed it and I went back to watching the video.
Exactly.
Which is really nice,
which is better. And also I just feel like the whole... first of all, two things. One, it's something like a $2 billion injection into the British economy. So it's not... Yeah. It's let's be clear, like, this is not a bad thing for England.
No.
And two, I had this very real moment that it was like the first time I'd had, and this is going to sound so cheesy, you guys, but like, I had real joy watching it. Like, pure, unadulterated joy that this was happening in the world in front of billions of viewers. And it was so wonderful compared to so much of what's happened in front of billions of viewers over the last couple of years.
Yeah.
Like, I had real, pure joy for the future watching it, which maybe is crazy. I don't know, but I did.
No, I think that's crazy.
Don't yuck my yum,
Yeah.
Facebook.
I think it's nice. Speaking of women in the media, the question I have is, what do you think of the candidate for governor, Stacey Abrams, and her work?
She's a romance novelist.
She what?
She
Whoa. Like, I was already super into her,
In
and
fact,
now I'm
she
like,
wrote for Avon.
no.
And now her pen name is gone from my head, but someone will tell you in comments what her pen name is.
Oh my God.
And
That's
isn't it amazing?
Amazing.
And she doesn't hide from it. She's like,
Oh.
that was her life before
I love
this.
her even more. That's
I mean,
amazing.
I give her all my money.
Yeah.
I mean,
that's
and also, I
marvelous.
mean, on top of it, she's highly qualified.
Sure.
She's incredible.
No, I actually think, you know what? I think more
But
romance
this is-
novelists should run for
Let
office.
the romance novelist lead the way, is what I have
Frankly,
to say about that.
I feel very good about that. Like, it is not easy to write a book.
Selena Montgomery.
Yes,
Yeah.
Selena Montgomery, thank you. Thank you, whoever that was.
I am all for more romance novelists running for elected office.
Yeah.
You ought to think about it.
Well, I live in New York City, so
Yeah.
you need people, outside of New York being...
Well, I don't
running
know.
for
I feel like
office.
New York City could use a couple more romance novelists on city council, but that's neither here nor there. It's certainly not something I would talk about too deeply as a public employee. So I want to get back to the fact that you read a lot of romance and ask, how do you find time to write so many romance novels? Because I know a lot of people who read romance write, and they read, and romance novels are quick reads generally, but they're usually long, like 400 pages or whatever. How do you sort of balance all these different ways? Your whole life is romance in many ways. So how do you?
Isn't
how
that
do you,
the best?
Yeah, that's great. That's great. You probably are the only person I feel like has a better job than I do.
Oh,
Yeah.
I don't know that that's true, because I wish I could be a librarian just so that I could make people read romance novels all the time.
It's pretty great. Yeah, that is one thing, and I have to say too, for all the librarians out there, my favorite tip for I did a webinar recently about readers advisory for all sorts of genres, and for romance is most people won't ask librarians. They won't say, like, give me a romance novel. They'll just say, like, I'm going on vacation, which not everyone wants to read romance on vacation. But when you say to people, like, oh, would you be interested in a romance novel? If they are a romance reader, that to me is one of the purest joys. Because a lot of people don't talk to librarians about romance because
They're nervous.
They're
about
nervous, or like a
judgment.
romance, a librarian has been very mean to them in the past. You can often, in a lot of libraries, tell how they feel about romances by where they are or what condition they're in. Or whether they have the new books by popular authors, and just that look on people's faces where it's like, this librarian reads romance
She's
too?
unlocked it for me.
Yeah, and then it's like, da-da-da-da. And then so many, I can't tell you how many readers too have been like, no, I've never tried one. And so then to be able to walk them over, if they're interested, be like, well, why don't you take one with everything else? See if it works
Maybe you'll
for
like
you.
it.
Maybe
It's
you'll
the
like
library.
it. It's the library.
It's
Maybe you like it, maybe you won't. And people, more times, you always say to people when you do readers advisory, well, if you don't like it, come back. If you do like it, come back. Like, doesn't matter, it's up to you, but I just want to keep talking to you about this. And I would say romances were more likely to make people actually come back and seek me out than a lot of other types of books.
Well, largely that's because it's such a huge genre.
Yeah, it's hard
that
to navigate when you're a new
very
reader. Yeah.
it's very hard to find an entry point.
Yep.
And then once you even find that first book, it's so massive. It's hard to.
You were actually the one who gave me my first list of romance novels to read.
Yeah, I know.
And I think that's part of what made it so easy to take to the genre, because it's like, okay, I'll read these 10.
Yeah.
And then you start to get your foothold a little bit.
And for those of you, that list is now much larger.
Yes.
And you can find it on my website.
It's a great
It's
list.
sarahmaclean.net/recommended. Past tense, recommended.
And a great collection development tool.
And
librarian.
it's 160 or something books long now. And I add to it every week.
All
because I read a
genres.
book every day.
all genres, all
Yeah,
everything. Yeah.
across the board. I
It's
try,
great.
and if there's anything, for those of you who are readers, if there's anything that you feel is missing from that list, like, please let me know. And I will either add to it, or it's actually a great way for me to find the book that I'm going to read next.
Yeah.
Then I just go looking and I read them for you.
Especially for self-published books, where I feel like, especially as more voices are coming into
Yeah.
romance, many are coming through self-publishing or getting their start through self-publishing, which can be hard to parse through. It's just like the volume is even greater than the volume of traditional published books. But I feel like you find a lot of great stuff.
I do. I mean, I read a book a day.
Yeah.
And so I try really hard to make that list as diverse as possible. So the only time that I don't sort of switch it up every day is when I find a new author and then I become obsessed. And as you've all done, read the whole 18 books by Cressley Cole.
Yep.
Which I highly recommend. That was the best 2 weeks of my life. And but the I think that for self-published and indie authors especially, it's also about discoverability. There are, especially now that Romantic Times is closed, unfortunately,
Very unfortunate.
there just aren't great resources to figure out who's got new books coming out. There's a great website called Women of Color in Romance, which tracks them as they come out on release days or release weeks. But leading in, it's tough to find.
Also a good collection development tool.
Yeah.
Librarians.
She's on Twitter. It's run by a woman named Rebecca Weatherspoon, and she's on Twitter at WOC in Romance. I think the N is there. It might not be, but it might be. But you'll find it. Women of Color in Romance.
Do you see any other trends sort of blossoming coming up, or things? Are there things you'd like to see in romance?
I think we're going to start seeing more sci-fi romance.
Ooh, that would be great.
We have sci-fi romance, but it's a tiny subsection of the genre, and I think we'll start to see more. I think we're also somebody not long ago, actually a mutual friend of ours, Jen Northington, used the term romantasy with me a few months ago, which is fantasy romance. There are a few. Amanda Boucher writes a great fantasy series. Her Fire series, the first one is called A Promise of Fire. And that's fantasy set. And there are a few other fantasy set romances. Carolyn Sparks is writing a fantasy set series right now, but I think we're going to start seeing more mashups, and that's what I really want to see.
That would be awesome.
Things that are like Game of Thrones meets romance, which seems impossible, but surely someone brilliant is out there.
I think that's, to me, one of the real joys of romance is the person has to follow these very strict rules.
Yeah.
Well, it's only the 2 rules, I guess, but they're quite strict. And two very different rules from every other genre, including literary fiction, which is, of course, its own genre.
Right.
And that, to me, it's like, it's almost the same joy I get out of formalist poetry, where it's like, well, I know you have to do it in 16 lines. How are you going to do it?
Yeah.
And so it's exciting to me to think about people sort of challenging themselves in that way.
Sure.
I'd also love, I've seen more contemporaries where the happy ending is not a wedding.
Right. That's called Happy for Now.
And I love it. And it's that is hard to pull off. Or more queer romance that's historical, which is, again, like, if you want to be in any way historically accurate, very hard to pull off. But it's been a real joy to see authors, for the most part, tackling this and really being very successful and finding a great way to get a new story out there.
I mean, and there's no doubt that there's conflict in the sort of setup of a story like that. But I'm thinking about Cat Sebastian's most recent, which is called Unmasking the Marquess? Unmasked by the Marquess. Sorry, I'm trying to think of the storyline. So it must be by the Marquess.
Is that how you say that word?
Marquess.
I've been saying Marquess for years. It's not a word you really say
it
out
how
loud. You would know
I'll
better
allow
than me.
it.
Yeah, no.
It's
not a word you say out
British
loud very frequently.
It's Marquess.
Marquess, okay.
Maybe in American pronunciation it's Marcus, but Marquess,
nice to
we
learn
don't
something.
have it. And then it's in French, it's Marquis, obviously.
Right.
And now we've done that. So
Hey,
but
you got to learn something every day.
What I loved about that, so the conceit of that book is the heroine is non-binary. So and presents as, and is living in disguise. It's a twisted, for those of you who are romance lovers, it's a twist on the trope, on the heroine in pants trope. But in this particular case, she's non-binary. She lives as, she uses the pronoun she, and but she dresses as a man and presents as a man, and that is her comfort, is presenting as a man. And she falls in love with a marquis, and a marquis needs a marchioness, right? Like
another word I didn't know how to say until just now.
well, you're welcome. This is great. But I think what's fast. So of course that's part of the conflict is, how is this going to resolve? But Kat resolves it so perfectly.
She does such a
and
good
so
job.
effortlessly.
Her male historical's the same way, where you're like, how are you going to pull this off? And she always does.
And it's beautifully done, and it just reminds us that we spend so much time, especially in historical readers and writers, spend so much time saying, oh, but the law, oh, but the history, oh, but,
Right.
would that really have happened? And I think what we forget is that, of course, it would have happened.
Sure.
Of course, people fell in love. Of course, people fell in love with people who it was illegal to fall in love with, and they made it work. And Kat makes it work every time in such a beautiful, like, honest, delicious way.
Yeah.
So I think if you're thinking of writing historical about a kind of unconventional match, read every Cat Sebastian book, and then you'll see that it can be done perfectly.
Yeah. It just takes a little, it must have happened.
Probably wasn't always
happy,
of course
but
it happened. And we know this also from history. It did happen. I have seen it in paintings. So
there's a novelist who I love, not a romance novelist, but we won't hold it against him. His name's Nick Harkaway, also British. And I saw him speak in the fall, and he said a sentence that's really resonated with me, where he said, I fear, as humans, we have lost the wind conditions for a better world. And that, like, one of our real challenges as a species is we've gotten so obsessed with can you do things and how much they cost, and, like, that we've stopped dreaming, like, what would it, and this idea came out of he was speaking to astronauts, so he stopped thinking about, like, what would it be like to go to Mars? What would we want it to feel like? What would we expect to find? What would it be like to be that person? And just been like, how much is it going to cost? And when do we expect to do it, and what experiments are we going to run? And that weirdly to me applies a lot to romance novels, where they offer you the wind conditions to a better world, where it's like, and maybe sometimes in a simplified way, but it's like these things could happen. You don't need to believe that. Of course people fall in love. A funny thing I found with the wedding is how many people shared their own family histories.
Yeah.
Did you notice that?
Yeah.
From all different backgrounds, people were like, actually, this reminds me, if you think this kind of love can't happen, like, this reminds me of this story in my family.
Sure.
And so people see it all the time in their real lives, but it's hard to grant that it could happen to people you don't know, I suppose. Right. I don't know. Do you get a lot of people sharing love stories with you?
Oh,
when you write a romance novel?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. People want to talk. One of the things about love is that it feels very ubiquitous, right? It's it's everywhere around us in the world, and we use it to do all sorts of things. We use it to sell car insurance and Tic Tacs and, clothing, but we also use it to represent, we use it to represent sort of a long history of human nature, for example. And obviously not everybody has experienced, romantic love, but love is a part of our lives, and whether or not we're experiencing or not, we're surrounded by it.
Right.
And so I think it is a thing where everyone has a story to tell. Sometimes it's heartbreak, and sometimes it's not, and sometimes it's disinterest, and sometimes it's not. But when they hear that you're a romance novelist, you get a lot of, let me tell you my story.
That's kind of nice.
Which is really lovely.
Must be a lovely way to meet new people.
It's it's a lovely conversation to have.
Yeah.
I'm the first person to ask, like, how someone's met their partner, because it feels to me like that meeting is where all the magic is. So
that's really lovely. Yeah. What other books would you recommend to people? Since you've said a lot of, like, authors and titles through this whole thing,
off
but
the cuff.
Are there other new releases people should rush out and get?
Okay, let me think. I just 2 days ago finished Naima Simone's Scoring Off the Field. Naima writes, it's the first, I think it's the first, might be the second in a football series. It's the first one I read, which is why for me it's the first. It's Friends to Lovers, which I think is really hard to pull off. Some people love Friends to Lovers. I personally do not love Friends to Lovers, but this book works so well because I love unrequited love. And this is...
Can I hold you right there?
Please.
I have a question related to that with tropes.
Yes.
Do you think people's favorite tropes tell you something about them as a person?
I think your favorite trope is basically your id. Like,
Whoa.
and so the books that
That makes me a little minus second chance romance.
That's
so
awesome,
that
and
makes
that's
me a
so
little
good though,
nervous,
because
yeah.
it's essentially what a second chance romance is just about change, right? It's that fantasy. It's really common fantasy for romance readers. It's a common fantasy for people in general. It's why we love a bad boy, right? Because we love the man. It's why we love a prince story,
right?
So we love the man who's willing to sort of like sacrifice his whole backstory, like his whole identity for you,
right?
And in Second Chances, we've actually seen the failure, and the change has to be on the page, very clearly done.
I think there's such an astrology thing here. Like that would be fun. We
the
should
doctor is in.
We should like assign for each astrological sign like their 2 or 3 favorite tropes.
Yeah,
I bet you could probably.
I bet
do
you
that.
could do it,
Yeah.
but I do think. Do we have a question? Oh.
Well, I was just going to say,
we done?
I know, it's so hard because it's
We're done.
such
I'll
a great...
leave you with
but-
your favorite trope is your id.
Very nice. We have one last question.
Yeah.
What are you working on right now?
Oh.
Yeah, I'm working on book 2 of the Bare Knuckle Bastards, which I think it's public now that the title is Brazen and the Beast. And it's
nice.
about the second brother, Beast.
Subtle too. Also subtle.
And I'll tell you, and you've not met the heroine if you've read this book.
Okay.
But
we did meet the hero.
yes, and it's a rivalry book. So think like the Hating Game, but historical, set in Covent Garden.
Is this going to be a quartet, a trilogy?
It's a trilogy so far.
Oh.
I mean,
You're going to be like Madeline
you never
Lingle.
know.
Like, every 10 years they decide Madeline Lingle.
J.K. Rowling.
Like, oh, it's a trilogy. Oh, no, it's a quartet. Oh, no, it's a quintet. Oh, okay, sure, whatever you want.
Well,
Madeline Lingle.
I mean, I've written a quartet, and by the end of the 4 books, I knew what the 4th book was for so long that finally when I wrote it, I was like, I'm so tired of writing in this world because
you're done.
I'm fully done, but
Yeah.
I always leave the door open to go
You
back
can always
to
go back.
someone.
People love that.
Yeah. And it's fun to populate the books. You will see all the scoundrels will be in these books. You'll see the bar from the Day of the Duchess, the tavern from the Day of the Duchess, which is in Covent Garden. Yeah.
Cool.
We're so excited.
Yeah.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you. Thanks, Sarah. This was great.
Thank
Be
you.
sure to check out Wicked and the Wallflower out in June. This has been a conversation between author Sarah MacLean and librarian Stephanie Anderson. Thank you, guys.